but we still have our own indigenous way of empowering people and promoting inclusion and as well as equality. Now, how we think about the what is empowerment, inclusion, equality. So the three agencies, we have given some sort of a definition, or I would like to unpack these three concepts. Now, empowerment here, we think of promoting a sense of agency or expanding the freedom of choice and action, as well as increasing control over resources and the decision that affects one's life. So basically, empowerment means building assets and capabilities, decision-making power of individual so that they can become an agent of change. Now, the second concept is about inclusion. Sometimes we think that it is an burst of exclusion. So inclusion means ensuring no one is left behind. That is what we see as one of the fundamental principles of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So we can ensure no one leaving behind through developing institutions, policies, and norms, and behavioral practices, and removing the barriers which prohibit for including certain groups, social groups, gender. There are various dimensions, actually 7 or 8 attributes are in the 2030 Agenda. Now in equality, we are talking about addressing disparity in opportunity and outcomes. 2018 report on inequality, I think Nagesh has also introduced a concept of impact. So there are now 3 dimensions, this gap I pointed out, we will also look into, but at the moment we are saying that outcome impact more or less similar, but that brings the vulnerable dimension. Now here, I would like to make a certain distinction between empowerment and inclusion. Empowerment, inclusion, they reinforce each other. They are very much related. But what is the difference? It's very difficult sometimes to find a difference between the two when the concepts are interrelated. So here we are pointing out that empowerment is related with individual or small groups, whereas inclusion has to do with at a macro level, at a state level. So if you change the social norms and behavior, that means that is a societal. When you develop a new sort of policy and incentives or legislation, that is a state level. So that comes from the top or from the macro level to provide an environment for an agent to exercise his agency or to exercise his or her agency. Whereas empowerment has to do with individual or groups building their individual capabilities, human capabilities like education and health, or other forms of capital, physical, social, networking, so that an individual feels empowered. Now, whose empowerment or inclusion we are talking about? So, these words that you see here, women and girls, children and youth, informal workers, older person, indigenous peoples, refugees, IDPs, all these words, they come from 2030 Agenda. So 2030 Agenda has identified these groups or these populations as vulnerable groups. You will be wondering, the theme is inclusion, exclusion, but we don't find a single word about excluded groups or exclusion in the 2030 Agenda language. Instead, we have vulnerable groups. Now, we'd like to get informed from South Asia perspective, who else are the vulnerable groups? So, whether all these are, or there are some other groups which are vulnerable. So actually, empowerment and inclusion of these vulnerable groups is necessary. Now again, the concept of empowerment, inclusion, equality, they are also embedded into 2030 Agenda. you can find some examples or some of the targets which are pointed out, which talks about right and justice, norms and practices, participation and voice, resources and capabilities. So basically, we are thinking about planning to bring these 4 dimensions or 4 aspects, building on our 2030 agenda, their targets and goals, these 4 dimensions to explore or to take empowerment inclusion as a framework for promoting equality. So this report is thinking of empowerment and inclusiveness approach can be applied to promote equality of outcomes relevant for SDG, but it doesn't mean that when there is equality, it doesn't promote empowerment, because these 3 concepts are very much interlinked, they are interdependent. So although the report will tend towards empowering people, talking about inclusion, and then after leading to outcome in opportunity or outcome equality, but we also recognize the fact that equality will also bring empowerment and inclusion. Now, so these 4, right and justice, institution, norm and practices, resources and capabilities, participation and voice, these 4 areas on which our distinguished panelists will also make their deliberations. But we think that these 4 areas these are the 4 domains of change where state and non-state actors work on these areas. There could be various good practices for promoting rights and justice, for bringing new legislations, law, rules and regulations, institutions, or promoting new sort of norms and behaviors. So basically, norms and behaviors, they are informal institutions, but we have also formal institutions which are basically delivered by the state in forms of written law, regulation, rules, policies. But compared to formal rules and regulations or law and policy, in South Asia or in many society, we find informal rules and regulations. They play a pertinent role. So that's why unless we change our norms and behavior starting from individual level, at household level, or different levels of society, it's very difficult. Mere state provision of some policy and regulation could not make a change, could not promote, or could not ensure that no one is left behind. So that's very important. Now, participation is also necessary in all phases or in all aspects of life. During the process of preparation of the project or implementation of project or monitoring evaluation of any interventions. Similarly, we also need to build the voices of people and agencies. So these are 4 domains of change on which we would like to hear. With this, I would like to end my brief presentation. Basically, this presentation is not meant making a very detailed deliberations, rather would like to hear your views, perspectives, about which there will be questions that are already circulated. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Tiwari, for bringing out key points that the report would be focusing on, and also putting across this very idea of interrelated resilient capacities that are of key significance. You have also identified what parameters one may leverage for understanding empowerment, inclusion, and equality. I have now great pleasure in getting the panel on. As in the note you might have captured, we would be talking about 4 different themes on resources and capabilities, rights and justice, participation and voice, and norms and practice. So each panelist, we have given one particular dimension to cover in their 5 to 6 minute long intervention. So I have great pleasure in inviting long-standing friend of RIS, His Excellency Professor Bishambar Pakral, to talk about resources and capabilities. And as he just proposed, he would also be highlighting on the interlinkages between these 4 pillars. So, Professor Pokhrel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sajin. It's always a pleasure to be a part of UNISCAP and RIS event. It's like homecoming for me. That's what I have been doing for the last couple of decades. So frequent changes in the responsibility given to us has made me a bit confused. What issue shall I pick up, Until this morning I had a feeling like we got to be jack of all. So what I'm merely trying to do at this moment to justify my professional existence over here is to try to establish the linkages between different issues that have been given, like rights and justice, norms and practices, participation and voice, resources and capabilities. I will be taking 1 minute each for each of the issues. The establishing the linkages, I personally think, between these goals of the SDGs and our efforts to prepare appropriate indicators to assess and monitor the goals is largely because of our experience in MDGs. Somebody were talking about some of the lapses that MDGs had and were suggesting us to take lessons from that particular failure. So one area MDGs failed short was on inclusion, both in how the goals were developed and in how they were being monitored. So talking about the first issue that have been already given in the distributed notes, human rights, I think, is a powerful tool in making governance system accountable to people's empowerment. International civil society organizations, and human rights NGOs globally have been advocating to ensure that there are no human rights violations. The advocacy is concerned with the right to be heard, advancing gender justice, fair sharing of natural resources, and financing for development, especially for achieving universal essential services for the empowerment. Available study shows that there is a value of empowering women. So you were talking about, talking something about the gender part and then other contributions of the NGOs. So I think if we go through available resources, study shows there is a value of empowering women through the legal education, through legal training, through the provision of legal services and preparing them to question and negotiate country-specific discriminatory cultural sort of norms. Each country to have a significant discrimination prevalent. So this strategy may cover long gestation period in industrial economics. We call it short gestation, long gestation. So this strategy may cover long gestation period, but it will make them free from state and community decision makers' interest to maintain the status quo, situation for exercising their power. This issue has been highlighted even by the human rights lawyer and Nobel laureate, Shirin Ebadi, in her one of the important writings. Now, coming back to the poverty, poverty is not only the lack of money that we usually say. It is about not having power, lacking ability to influence institutions that make laws, which govern us. It is about not having the ability to determine own destiny. And poverty is about not having the voice. UNICEF considers if the poor are given the space to be part of the decisions and plans, they also can be the part of the solution. So their engagements in these deliberations are extremely important. There is a consensus that increasing poor people's access to opportunity, security, and empowerment contributes economic growth and poverty reduction. About resources and capabilities, there is a feeling that for poor people, freedom is severely curtailed by their voicelessness and powerlessness. Empowerment refers broadly to the expansion of freedom of choice and action to shape one's life. It implies control over resources and decisions. Therefore, World Bank reiterates that empowerment is the expansion of assets and capabilities of the poor to participate in, negotiate with, influence, control, and hold accountable institutions that affect their lives. So to conclude, I would say some questions really needs to be answered. Why policies couldn't satisfactorily achieve inclusiveness? What makes inclusive society? And how to achieve inclusive growth? Some efforts had been made in developing a paper for UNISCAP about 2-3 years ago. I don't even remember exactly. It was on the social